The fog over Baker Street lingered thick that morning, a heavy white curtain through which the weak sunlight struggled to press. The familiar rattle of carriage wheels against the cobblestone seemed muffled, as if the city itself had chosen to pull its blanket tighter against the chill. I had just set down my teacup when Mrs. Hudson entered with a letter clutched gingerly between her fingers. Her expression, though polite as ever, betrayed a curiosity she could not contain. "For you, Mr. Holmes," she said, placing it on the breakfast tray beside my friend. "It was delivered with haste, and the gentleman insisted it be placed directly in your hands." Holmes, who had been sprawled in his chair with his violin across his lap, set the bow aside and leaned forward with the sharpened attention of a predator catching scent. He studied the seal before breaking it. The crest embossed in wax was unmistakable even to me, a winged lion rampant clutching a gospel beneath its paw. The symbol of Venice. Holmes read silently, his long fingers gripping the letter with unusual tightness. Then, with a small exhalation that might have been amusement or approval, he handed it across to me. The words were formal, penned in neat, decisive Italian, but translated into English by a careful secretary's hand. "To the esteemed Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the Council of Venice, through its appointed representative, Signor Marco Bellini, humbly requests your presence in our city. In recent weeks, the serenity of our canals has been disturbed by events of most unusual character. Citizens and gondoliers alike speak of an apparition, pale, spectral, gliding over the waters by night. Its presence coincides with unexplained drownings and disappearances. Terror grows and commerce suffers. We fear the matter will soon bring Venice to disorder. We entreat you, therefore, to lend your expertise. Passage for you and your companion has been secured aboard the steamer leaving Dover in 3 days. We await your acceptance with urgency. With deepest respect, Marco Bellini, Councillor of Venice." I read it twice before setting it down. "Ghosts and apparitions, Holmes?" I asked, my tone skeptical though not dismissive. "Surely they could summon a priest or a magician if they wish for such things exorcised." Holmes had risen, pacing across the carpet with quick strides, his mind already in motion. When a city as ancient and pragmatic as Venice, long accustomed to superstition, appeals not to clergy but to reason, it suggests that the phenomenon, however draped in mystery, has its roots in the tangible. This, Watson, is no haunting but a problem dressed in the cloak of one. He paused at the window, peering into the white murk that concealed the street below. "Consider, my dear fellow, a phantom visible to many always above the waters, accompanied by drownings. There is contrivance here, design, and where there is design there is a designer." "You speak as though you had already solved it," I said, though I knew better. Holmes did not leap to conclusions without first securing the ground beneath them. "Not solved," he replied with a faint smile, "but scented. The quarry lies ahead, Watson, and the chase promises to be worthy of us." Within the hour, Holmes had written his reply of acceptance. Over the following days, I busied myself with preparations while Holmes alternated between restless energy and long spells of silence, his mind no doubt rehearsing possibilities. He spoke little save to remind me of small but essential details: a stout walking stick for navigating uncertain ground, a revolver discreetly tucked into my luggage, and, curiously, a small waterproof lantern which he insisted I procure. The journey to Dover passed uneventfully, though Holmes remained more withdrawn than usual, eyes fixed upon the horizon as though he could already see the domes and spires of Venice shimmering beyond the mist. On the steamer, he paced the deck like a man caged, his thin figure outlined against the gray sea, his gaze always upon the shifting water. It was not until we neared the Adriatic that his demeanor altered. The air grew warmer, the sea calmer, and Holmes's eyes brightened with the glint of anticipation. "Observe, Watson," he said one evening as the sun bled red into the waves. "The city we approach was built upon water itself, its foundations hidden, its secrets submerged. A perfect breeding ground for illusions. If one wished to conjure a ghost, where better than upon a stage already half-dream? When at last we entered the Venetian lagoon, the sight was unlike anything I had known. The city seemed to float upon the water, its domes and campaniles rising like visions from a painter's canvas. Gondolas slid silently between palaces whose walls bore the weight of centuries, their reflections trembling upon the surface. There was beauty, yes, but also something uncanny, an atmosphere of half-light and shadow, as if the city itself lived in perpetual masquerade. At the docks we were met by a tall, grave man in a dark cloak, Signor Bellini. His eyes, sharp and weary, scanned us with the urgency of one who bore both responsibility and fear. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he greeted us, bowing slightly. "Your presence honors us. I wish I could welcome you to Venice with celebration, but I fear only gloom awaits." Holmes inclined his head politely. "We are at your service, Signor Bellini. Tell us what you have observed without embellishment." As we walked through the narrow alleys, Bellini recounted the events. It began a fortnight past. A gondolier returning from the northern canals swore he saw a figure of white light gliding across the water. Since then, more sightings, always at night, always above the canals. Men say the apparition points toward them before vanishing. Those who see it fall into terror. 3 have drowned, 2 merchants disappeared. Superstition spreads like fever. Already commerce falters. Gondoliers refuse certain routes. The city lives in fear. "Your description is useful," Holmes said, his tone clipped and precise. "The figure, how would you describe it?" "Human form?" Bellini hesitated. "Human, yes, though indistinct. Some say tall, some say shrouded. None dare approach. It glows as though lit from within. A ghost, they insist." Holmes gave a low hum of thought, but asked no further questions until we reached our lodgings. The council had arranged a modest but comfortable suite overlooking a narrow canal, where the water lapped softly against the stone steps. From our window we could see gondolas sliding past, their lanterns casting golden circles on the black surface. That first night, Holmes insisted we go out at once. The sooner we witness the environment of this so-called ghost, the sooner we peel away its disguise. We engaged a gondolier, an elderly man who trembled at the request, but agreed for a generous payment. The air was cool and the mists lay heavy upon the canals. Venice by night was a dreamscape of shifting shadows and sudden silence, broken only by the dip of the oar. I confess even my own heart beat faster as we drifted deeper into the maze of waterways. Hours passed without incident. The gondolier whispered nervously, swearing that the ghost favored nights when the moon was high. Yet Holmes's eyes never ceased their restless sweep of the surroundings. Then, as we turned into a particularly narrow canal hemmed by decaying palaces, the gondolier gave a strangled cry. There, ahead of us, hovering above the water, was a figure, pale, shimmering, its form indistinct but unmistakably human. It glided slowly, silently, leaving ripples of light upon the water's surface. I felt a chill seize me, though reason battled against the sensation. The gondolier dropped his oar and clutched at the crucifix around his neck. Holmes, by contrast, leaned forward, every muscle taut with concentration. "Observe, Watson," he whispered. "Note the steadiness of its course. No wavering, no drift. It is not borne by current, but guided." Before I could reply, the figure vanished, dissolving into the mist as though it had never been. The gondolier, white-faced, begged us to turn back. Holmes acquiesced, but his expression was far from shaken. He had seen, I knew, what he needed. Back in our rooms, long past midnight, Holmes paced the floor while I tried to gather my thoughts. "You saw it, Holmes," I said. It was no trick of the eye. The thing glowed. Holmes stopped, turning to me with a gleam in his eyes. "Phosphorus, Watson, or another chemical luminescent in water. Mark how it glided, too steady for a phantom, too mechanical for a spirit. We chase not a ghost, but a device, and behind it men." He paused, his fingers steepled before him. "Tomorrow we shall begin where all good investigations must, at the water's edge. The ghost walks upon the canal, Watson, and upon the canal we shall find its footprints." The clock struck 3. Outside, Venice slumbered beneath her veil of mist. Within, Holmes stood poised, his mind already navigating the hidden channels of mystery, as though he too were a gondola gliding through unseen waters toward the heart of the enigma. The following morning dawned gray, though Venice had a way of softening even the dreariest light. The mist clung low to the water, curling around the facades of palaces and obscuring the bridges so that the city seemed to rise and vanish like some enchanted mirage. Holmes, already awake when I stirred, stood at the open shutters of our room, gazing down at the canal with that particular stillness of his that meant his mind was already dissecting the world before him. His hands rested lightly behind his back, but I noticed the faint tapping of his long fingers against one another, a sure sign of concentration. "You see, Watson," he said at length without turning, This city reveals itself most readily in its reflections. Look there. He gestured to the water where the rippled images of window arches and carved balconies trembled. Every distortion, every shimmer, every trick of the eye. It is here one must look for deception. Venice is itself a living experiment in illusion. I dressed quickly, accustomed by now to Holmes's abrupt starts, and joined him at the window. The canal below was silent save for the occasional dip of an oar. And yet, I said, it is not the city's natural illusions that disturb us, but the deliberate invention of a man intent upon spreading terror. Just so, Holmes replied. He finally turned, his eyes bright. And men who construct illusions must also construct the means by which they operate. That is our quarry today. Not the phantom itself, but the mechanism and the man behind it. Signor Bellini met us at our lodgings shortly thereafter, his expression one of weary urgency. He had not slept, I suspected, for the lines beneath his eyes had deepened. "The council insists I accompany you," he said as we set out into the narrow streets. "They believe it my duty to aid you in any way possible. But I warn you, gentlemen, Venice is a city where every alley has a secret. You will not find truth easily here." Holmes gave him the faintest of smiles. "Truth, signor, is rarely found easily anywhere, but it has a way of revealing itself to those who know how to look." We began our morning along the northern canals, where most of the sightings had been reported. The gondolier who had ferried us the night before had refused to go near the place again. But Bellini secured another, a younger man, whose boldness seemed born more of desperation for payment than true courage. He rode us silently while Holmes's sharp gaze swept every arch, every rooftop, every darkened recess where shadow lingered. The city by daylight was magnificent. Carved stone balconies overhanging water that glimmered like polished glass. Narrow bridges connecting palaces like ribbons stretched across the void. Yet beneath that beauty lay decay, the green stain of algae on foundations, the faint smell of stagnant water. It was a city balanced precariously between splendor and ruin, much like the tales Bellini told us of its ghost. "Here," Bellini said, gesturing toward a stretch of canal hemmed by leaning houses. "It was along this passage that the merchant Zanetti vanished 3 nights ago. His gondola was found adrift at dawn, empty." Holmes motioned for the gondolier to halt. He studied the walls rising from the water, the narrowness of the space, the overhanging balconies that nearly touched across the canal. "Ideal," he murmured, "for the stringing of wires. Watson, do you observe the discoloration there, just below that shutter?" I followed his gaze and indeed saw a faint residue clinging to the stone, pale, almost chalk-like. "Phosphorus," I ventured. Holmes gave a small nod. "Or something akin. A trace left by careless handling, perhaps. Note also the position. Precisely at a height where a lantern might be drawn across, casting the illusion of a floating figure." The gondolier crossed himself quickly, muttering under his breath. Bellini frowned. "You believe the ghost is nothing but a contrivance of lights?" "I believe," Holmes said evenly, "that men of flesh and blood have much to gain from convincing others of spirits. Ghosts do not demand payments, Signor Bellini. Extortionists do." We proceeded further, Holmes insisting on stopping frequently to examine stone ledges, mooring posts, and the undersides of bridges. His keen eye noted things invisible to others. A faint scrape upon the stone where a rope had been drawn taut, a small hook embedded in masonry, the glimmer of something metallic half submerged near a piling. He retrieved it with the tip of his cane, a fragment of wire, fine but strong, glistening damply in the morning light. Each discovery seemed to tighten his conclusions, though he spoke little of them. I had long since learned that Holmes preferred to allow his deductions to simmer until they could be presented with irrefutable clarity. By midday, Bellini insisted we pause. He guided us into a small trattoria overlooking a sunlit square, where masked vendors sold trinkets to passing children. Even in daylight, the air of masquerade hung about Venice. Anonymity seemed woven into its very soul. As we ate, Bellini lowered his voice. "Holmes, if this is indeed the work of men, then they are men with dangerous power." Whispers spread of a society that controls certain canals, demanding tribute for safe passage. They have grown bolder these past weeks. Perhaps the ghost is their weapon. Holmes looked up from his untouched plate, his eyes narrowing. "A society, you say? Organized? With influence?" "So it is rumored. No one dares name them. Those who refuse payment find their boats overturned, their goods lost, or worse, themselves drowned. Holmes's lips curved faintly. Fear, you see, Watson, is the most efficient weapon of all, and nothing inspires fear so swiftly as the supernatural. These men cloak themselves not merely in masks, but in phantoms. Our gondolier returned us to the water after the meal, though his nerves grew more apparent as the afternoon wore on. At one narrow crossing, he refused outright to pass, muttering that the ghost would surely claim them if they entered. Bellini argued, but Holmes laid a hand lightly upon the man's shoulder. Very well. Your fear is useful to me. Tell me where you believe the ghost strongest. The gondolier hesitated, then pointed toward a crumbling palace at the junction of 3 canals. There, he whispered. Many have seen it there, rising from the water. Holmes studied the palace carefully. Its windows were shuttered, its walls streaked with damp, yet I noticed faint ropes dangling where once a banner might have hung. Holmes's eyes followed the lines upward to the rooftop, then back down to the canal. An intersection, he said softly. Multiple routes of escape. Yes, this would serve admirably as a stage. We returned to our lodgings as dusk fell, the mist once more beginning to thicken. Holmes grew restless, pacing as he considered his observations. Tonight, he declared at last, we must see the ghost again. But this time, Watson, we shall not merely watch, we shall pursue. I confess I felt a thrill of apprehension at his words. The apparition we had glimpsed the night before still lingered in my memory, half unearthly in its glow. Yet Holmes's certainty was contagious. If he declared it a trick, then a trick it must be, though one contrived with skill. We set out again at midnight, accompanied this time not by a hired gondolier, but by Holmes himself, who had insisted we procure a small boat of our own. He rowed with surprising competence, his lean figure bent over the oar while I kept watch. The canals were hushed, their silence broken only by the occasional drip of water or distant laughter from masked revelers returning late from some festivity. The air was thick, the fog curling like smoke about us. It was near the junction of the 3 canals that we saw it once more. A shimmer at first, faint against the mist, then growing into the same pale figure we had witnessed before. It glided with eerie silence, its form indistinct, its glow casting ripples upon the black surface. This time it lingered longer, almost beckoning us forward. Holmes's movements were swift. He drew the lantern he had insisted I pack, shielding its light until the right moment. Then, as the apparition drifted past a narrow bridge, he uncovered it suddenly, directing its beam not upon the ghost itself, but upon the air above and around it. For a moment I saw it clearly. Thin wires, almost invisible, stretching from the rooftops to guide the phantom's course. The glow emanated not from the figure itself, but from lanterns cleverly concealed within a translucent frame. There, Holmes exclaimed. Do you see, Watson? A puppet strung upon wires. But even as he spoke, the figure accelerated, gliding rapidly away down the canal. Holmes rowed furiously, the boat leaping forward beneath his strokes. I clutched the side, heart racing as the phantom darted ahead, its glow flickering in the fog. For a breathless span we pursued it through twisting waterways, under low bridges where the mist clung thickest. Yet just as we gained ground, the figure vanished utterly, as though swallowed by the night. Holmes slowed at last, breathing hard but triumphant. You saw it, Watson. The wires, the frame, it is no ghost but a machine. Our task now is to discover whose hands pull the strings. And the men who drowned? I asked grimly. Holmes's expression hardened. Collateral, perhaps, or witnesses silenced. Whatever the motive, this masquerade is no harmless trick. There is a darker purpose behind it, and we shall uncover it, the ripples fading into stillness once more. Venice lay shrouded in mist around us, beautiful, deceptive, secretive. Somewhere above those canals, men had strung their wires, weaving fear into the very fabric of the city. And as Holmes sat poised upon the oar, his eyes fixed upon the darkened palace roofs, with certainty that he would not rest until the phantom was unmasked and the shadows stripped of their disguise. The silence of the canal lingered long after the phantom's light had dissolved into mist, as though the waters themselves held their breath. Holmes rested the oar across his knees and stared into the fog with a sharpness that told me he was replaying every moment of the chase, each flicker of light, every taut line of wire glimpsed in our lantern's beam. His face, half shadowed by the hood of his cloak, bore the look I had seen often before at the cusp of revelation, a mingling of satisfaction at progress and impatience at what remained concealed. "Did you note, Watson," he said at last, "how the apparition quickened its pace once our lantern betrayed the wires?" "I did," I replied, still clutching the side of the boat, my pulse not yet steadied. "It seemed almost alive in its flight." "Not alive, but directed," Holmes corrected. "The operator must have been positioned to observe us. When the illusion was threatened, he hastened to withdraw it. That vanishing was no sorcery. It was a deliberate act of concealment. Our quarry saw us as surely as we saw him." I turned, peering into the blanketing fog that swallowed every rooftop. Then he was near, close enough to notice our pursuit. Holmes gave a curt nod. Close indeed, and skilled enough to retreat without betraying his hiding place. "But every device leaves its trace, Watson. We have glimpsed the puppet. Tomorrow we shall find the puppeteer." With that, he resumed rowing, guiding us back toward our lodgings. The canals were empty, save for the occasional creak of timber from some unseen boat, and the water mirrored the mists like dark glass. I confess I felt an unease creep over me then, not at the ghost itself, for Holmes had stripped that of its power, but at the thought of men who would so coldly manipulate fear for gain, and who might lurk even now above us, watching with unseen eyes. When we reached our quarters, Holmes wasted no time. He drew paper from his satchel and began sketching quickly, his long fingers moving with precision. "The wires stretched across this span, anchored here and here," he muttered, marking lines between rooftops. "The frame was lightweight, translucent, likely coated with phosphorus or a similar compound. A system of pulleys would permit smooth passage. And observe, when it accelerated, the pull must have come from this angle." He tapped the drawing sharply. "That rooftop, Watson. That is where our phantom retired tonight." "Then surely we should investigate it now," I urged, "before they dismantle their contrivance." Holmes shook his head. "Patience. To clamber across Venetian rooftops at this hour, without knowledge of their connections, would be folly. No. Better to approach by daylight when we may examine without fear of ambush. Besides," he added with a faint smile, "our adversaries will believe their ruse intact. That is to our advantage." He sealed the sketch into his notebook and finally allowed himself to sink into his chair, though his eyes remained restless. I slept little that night, haunted not by visions of glowing phantoms but by the thought of the unseen men who had watched us. The morning brought a pale sun, its light turning the canals to liquid gold. Holmes roused me early and wasted no time in setting out, Bellini joining us with evident anxiety. We navigated through the waking city until we came to the quarter Holmes had marked upon his sketch, the crumbling palace at the junction of 3 canals. Holmes studied the structure from below, his gaze moving with methodical slowness across its stonework. "Notice the balconies, Watson. See how the iron railings bear faint scratches where something has been affixed and removed. And there, on the uppermost level, a shutter that does not close flush. Our phantom's lair, I fancy." Bellini frowned. "But the palace has stood empty for years. Its owner died without heirs, and no one has claimed it since. Children say it is haunted." Holmes's lips twitched. "Convenient, is it not, that such a place should house our specter? Come, let us confirm." We disembarked and mounted the worn steps that led into the palace. The heavy door yielded to Holmes's pressure, its hinges groaning in protest. Within, the air was damp and cold, filled with the scent of mildew and stagnant water. Dust lay thick upon the cracked tiles. Yet as Holmes bent low, he pointed to faint tracks leading inward, the scuff of boots, recent enough to disturb the grime. We followed him through echoing corridors until we reached a stair that twisted upward into shadow. Holmes ascended swiftly, pausing only once to touch the wall where a faint residue gleamed under his fingers. He held them to the light and they shone faintly, a ghostly white. Phosphorus again. Our prey leaves his signature everywhere. At the top, we emerged into a wide chamber whose windows overlooked the canals. Here the truth of the ghost lay naked before us. Hooks had been hammered into the stone, pulleys fixed to beams. Coils of wire lay piled in corners, and against the wall leaned a frame of thin bamboo rods stretched with gauze, the very skeleton of the phantom we had chased. Lanterns fitted with tinted glass clustered beside it, their wicks blackened from use. Bellini gasped. "So it is true, it was a trick all along." Holmes examined the apparatus with a surgeon's care, his hands moving lightly over the wires. "Ingenious," he murmured. The figure could be raised from the water by counterweight, then drawn smoothly along these lines, its glow enhanced by mirrors set opposite. A child's puppet show, enlarged and draped in terror, yet effective precisely because men are more willing to believe in ghosts than in cunning. He straightened, his eyes sharp. But note, Watson, these tools are not abandoned. They are in readiness. The operators will return, and soon. Bellini shifted uneasily. Should we not alert the city guard? Seize them when they come. Holmes shook his head. Too soon, and we snare only the puppets, not the hand that moves them. No, we must watch. Tonight we shall lie in wait and learn who commands this masquerade. The day dragged in restless anticipation. Holmes allowed us no further investigation, insisting we conserve our strength. He spent the afternoon in quiet preparation, fashioning a length of rope into a noose, examining the revolver I had brought, and rehearsing the positions from which we might observe without being seen. His calmness contrasted with Bellini's nervous pacing, but I knew it masked an intensity that would find its outlet soon enough. When darkness fell, we returned to the abandoned palace, ascending silently to the chamber above. Holmes positioned us behind a crumbling partition that afforded a clear view of the wires and apparatus. There we waited, the silence broken only by the slow drip of water in some unseen corner. Hours passed, the city outside sinking into deeper slumber until at last footsteps echoed on the stairs. Holmes tensed, his hand upon my arm. 3 figures entered, their faces concealed by carnival masks of long-nosed design. They moved with practiced ease, each taking his place. One adjusted the lanterns, another prepared the frame, while the third tested the wires with a careful pull. Their voices, low and urgent, spoke in Venetian dialect, but I caught enough to understand their intent. The ghost would appear again that night, to patrol the waters and drive away those who resisted their demands. Holmes's eyes gleamed. He had drawn from his pocket a small notebook and scribbled rapidly, sketching their positions and noting their movements. I saw in his expression the fierce satisfaction of a hunter who has at last sighted his prey. Yet he gave no signal to intervene. He meant, I realized, not merely to catch these men, but to follow their trail further, to the master who commanded them. The ghost rose once more, assembled before our eyes, and launched upon its wires. Through a narrow slit in the shutters I glimpsed it gliding across the canal, its glow casting pale ripples on the water. From below came the distant cry of a gondolier who had caught sight of it, his fear carrying clearly in the night. The masked men chuckled softly, congratulating one another. Holmes's grip tightened on my sleeve. Now we know, he whispered. This is no specter, but the weapon of an organized band. We shall not strike tonight, but we have seen enough to close the noose. When at last the men departed, dismantling only part of their contraption and leaving the rest for future use, Holmes waited until their footsteps had faded before rising. He examined the remaining apparatus once more, then turned to Bellini. Your counsel must prepare, he said gravely. This is extortion masquerading as the supernatural. Tonight we have confirmed it. Tomorrow we shall set the snare, and the ghost of the canal will haunt Venice no more. We returned to our lodgings under the shroud of mist, our boat gliding silently through the water. The phantom no longer held power to chill me, for Holmes had stripped away its mystery, revealing the men and wires behind the glow. Yet as I looked upon the darkened palaces looming above, I could not shake the thought that greater forces still lurked unseen. Holmes himself seemed to share the sentiment, for he sat motionless at the prow, his gaze fixed upon the veiled rooftops, as if searching for the hidden eyes that watched from behind their masks. The city was still in darkness when we returned from the abandoned palace, though the faintest silver along the horizon hinted at dawn. Holmes refused rest. He had not spoken a word on the way back, and once inside our lodgings he seated himself by the narrow writing table, pulling his notebook close and sketching with quick, decisive strokes. His features were sharpened by the dim light of a single lamp, his lips compressed into a thin line of concentration. He, wearied from the long night, dropped heavily into a chair. Holmes, I began, you mean to go sleepless again? We have watched the ghost raised, seen the men who built it, traced their wires across the rooftops. Surely that is proof enough for Bellini and his counsel. Holmes did not look up from his page. Proof for a counsel, perhaps, but not for me. What we have witnessed is a mechanism, a handful of masked operators who play their part in a larger design. They are not the source, Watson, only the surface. I have no interest in lopping branches. The root is what must be torn from the earth, else the weed springs up anew. And you believe the root to be? He tapped the page with his pen. An organized society, Venetian in origin, perhaps ancient, certainly cunning. These men we spied are but their emissaries. They extort under the mask of superstition, but their ambitions extend further. Venice has lived long in shadows. It breeds such conspiracies as marshes breed vapors. I sighed, though I knew further argument was useless. When Holmes set his course, no storm could turn him. He sketched until the lamplight dimmed with the coming day, diagrams of pulleys and ropes, notes on the timing of the apparition, conjectures on how the wires had been strung unseen. At last, when the bells of the city announced morning, he rose, thin and restless, and declared that we would begin our investigation anew before the operators had time to adjust their scheme. Signor Bellini returned at first light, his face drawn from lack of sleep. Holmes received him with brisk energy, laying out what we had discovered. Bellini's eyes widened at the mention of the masked men and the contraption hidden in the palace. Then the city is not cursed, he murmured, almost to himself. It is deceived. Precisely, Holmes said. But deception requires access, knowledge of rooftops, and the confidence to move unseen. Such liberties are not taken by chance. Your council must ask who in Venice commands such freedom. Bellini hesitated. There are, names whispered, families of old influence, guilds that wield power in the shadows. But to accuse them without irrefutable evidence would ignite scandal. Then we must gather evidence, Holmes said simply. Tonight we watch them prepare the ghost. Tonight they will act again. And tonight, gentlemen, we shall not only watch but follow. The day crept forward with agonizing slowness. Holmes allowed no rest, leading us through narrow alleys and across bridges as he traced the canals surrounding the abandoned palace. He measured distances with his eye, calculated angles, and even clambered onto one or two low rooftops to study the alignment of the wires. More than once I caught him pausing to survey the city's labyrinth of water and stone as though it were a chessboard. Each canal a line of strategy, each palace a piece to be moved. By afternoon he had formed his plan. When the ghost appears, he told us, we shall let it draw us as before, but instead of pursuing the phantom itself, we shall shadow the operators. Men who can vanish into rooftops must have a path prepared. We will trace that path and see where it leads. I asked if he expected danger. He gave a thin smile. Without danger, Watson, there would be no sport. Darkness fell again, and with it the city slipped into that strange half-silence that belongs only to Venice. We returned to the abandoned palace, taking our place once more behind the partition. The hours stretched long, the faint creak of timbers, the scurry of a rat in the wall, the occasional lapping of water below were our only companions. At last, footsteps sounded on the stair, and the masked men entered just as before. This time I watched them with keener eye, noting how their movements bore the ease of long practice. One adjusted the lanterns with care, another tested the tension of the wires, while the third set the frame in place. The ghost rose again, luminous against the darkness, gliding out over the canal with unearthly poise. From below, a faint cry confirmed its success, a gondolier startled into fear. Holmes leaned close to me. Now, Watson, watch their departure. When their work was done, the three men dismantled part of the apparatus and gathered the lanterns into sacks. They spoke briefly in hushed tones, then, carrying their burdens, they slipped into the corridor beyond. Holmes was instantly on his feet, his movements noiseless, urging us after them. The pursuit that followed was unlike any I had experienced in London's fogs or countryside chases. Venice at night was a maze of bridges and narrow alleys, each turn leading into shadow. The men moved swiftly, confident in their knowledge of the labyrinth, yet Holmes matched them with uncanny instinct, reading their path as though it were inscribed upon the stones themselves. Bellini and I followed close, hearts pounding, striving to keep pace without sound. The masked men crossed two bridges, doubled back along a deserted quay, and at last vanished into a small courtyard hemmed in by decaying walls. Holmes halted us in the shadows of an arch. We waited, breath held, until a faint creak reached our ears. Holmes pointed upward. There, half hidden by vines, was a wooden door set high on the wall, swinging shut behind them. A private passage, Holmes murmured. An entrance concealed from casual sight. And where does it lead? We approached cautiously. The door, though weathered, yielded to Holmes's touch. Beyond it, a narrow stair wound upward into darkness. Holmes drew the small lantern he had carried since our first night, shielding its light with his cloak. Step by careful step we ascended, the air growing cooler, the silence oppressive. At last, the stair opened into a wide chamber lit by the faint glow of dying candles. What we saw there froze us in place. The chamber was furnished not as a dwelling, but as a hall of meeting. Heavy drapes muffled the walls, and in the center stood a table upon which maps of the canals were spread. Symbols marked certain routes with notes scrawled in Italian beside them. Masks of many shapes, plague Dr. Beaks, horned visages, blank ovals, hung upon the walls like mute sentinels. And there, gathered around the table, the three masked men joined half a dozen others, their voices low but urgent. Holmes drew us back into the shadows before we could be seen. His hand pressed my arm, steady but electric with tension. I caught only fragments of their speech, yet enough to understand. They spoke of merchants refusing tribute, of gondoliers who needed reminders, of shipments that would be delayed until fear compelled compliance. The ghost was but one of their tools, an emblem of terror to enforce their will. We waited as long as prudence allowed, then retreated silently down the stair. Outside once more, Holmes drew a long breath, his eyes alight with the fire of revelation. "Now we have them, Watson," he whispered fiercely. "Not merely operators, but a council of extortionists cloaked in masks as their phantom is cloaked in light. We know their lair, their methods, their very symbols. With this, Bellini, your counsel can act." Bellini's face was pale in the moonlight, yet there was steel in his voice. "It is worse than I feared. These men are not common criminals. They are of families that have walked our streets for centuries, wearing masks not only at carnival, but in the commerce of daily life. To expose them will shake Venice to its core. Better shaken than strangled," Holmes replied curtly. "Fear is their coin. Strip them of that and they are nothing." We parted from Bellini near dawn, he to summon trusted allies within the council, we to snatch a brief rest. Yet even in exhaustion, Holmes's mind did not slow. He spoke little, but as I drifted into sleep, I heard him murmuring half to himself, "Wires, lanterns, masks, men playing at phantoms. But who among them profits most? Who devised the scheme? There is a hand yet hidden, and until I see it, the picture is incomplete." And so Venice, with its veils of mist and echoing waters, held us tighter in its grasp. We had torn away one mask only to glimpse another beneath, and I felt with a certainty that chilled me that the deepest secret was yet to come. The pale light of morning had only just begun to wash the rooftops when Holmes roused me from a fitful sleep. I had scarcely closed my eyes, still haunted by the vision of that hidden chamber with its circle of masked conspirators, when his hand fell lightly upon my shoulder. He looked weary in body, for even he could not endure sleeplessness without toll, yet his eyes were alight with that keen brightness I had learned to recognize as the herald of pursuit. "Up, Watson," he said briskly. "The night has shown us the shadow of the beast, but daylight will allow us to trace its tracks. Bellini will rally his council, but before he acts we must know more. We have seen the masks, the symbols, the maps, but not yet the mind that directs them. And until I grasp that mind, I cannot be satisfied." I rose reluctantly, the ache of exhaustion heavy in my limbs. Still, I knew there was no dissuading him. Venice outside was stirring. The bells of early mass pealed across the canals, mingling with the first calls of gondoliers. The air was sharp and damp, carrying the faint brine of the lagoon. We set out on foot, Holmes striding quickly through the narrow alleys, his eyes darting from face to face, from shuttered window to balcony, as if every passerby might conceal a clue. The chamber we saw, he mused aloud, was no common gathering place. It bore signs of permanence, the draped walls, the table well worn by use, the masks arranged as if in ritual. "This is no mere gang of extortionists, Watson. It is a society rooted deep in Venice's marrow." "And you mean to challenge them?" I asked. "I mean to expose them," he corrected. "Challenge implies risk of defeat. Exposure leaves no ground upon which they may stand." We paused upon a small bridge, the water below glimmering faintly. Holmes leaned upon the rail, his gaze far off. "Mark this well, Watson. A ghost is raised above the canal to frighten gondoliers into obedience. But why here in this quarter and not another? Why not along the Grand Canal where commerce is richest? No, the choice is deliberate. These men guard something. Some path of trade, perhaps, or a secret passage known only to them. If we would strike at their heart, we must know what they guard." Before I could answer, a voice hailed us. Bellini approached, his face grave but resolute. "Holmes," he said, "I have spoken with those of the council whom I can trust. They are prepared to act, but they demand certainty. To move against men of standing in Venice without irrefutable proof would be ruinous." Holmes inclined his head. "And they are right. Proof we shall have. But first, Signor Bellini, tell me this. In your archives, in your city's hidden annals, have you ever heard of a society that veils itself in masks, that claims dominion over certain waters?" Bellini hesitated, then nodded. "There are tales, yes. Whispers of a group called La Fratellanza del Leone, the Brotherhood of the Lion. Old as the Republic itself, some say. They were smugglers once, then extortionists, sometimes protectors, always hidden. Many doubt they still exist. But I see now they do, and the ghost is their new mask." Holmes's eyes glittered. "The Brotherhood of the Lion, apt given Venice's emblem. Then it is they who orchestrate this masquerade. Tonight's discovery confirms it. But we must tie them to deeds that cannot be denied." Bellini looked troubled. "That will not be easy. They strike from shadows, and those who oppose them vanish into the waters." "All the more reason," Holmes replied calmly, "to strike first." We spent the day in cautious reconnaissance. Holmes insisted we return to the quarter near the Brotherhood's chamber, though not by the same path. He led us along winding alleys, through markets crowded with masked merchants, across bridges where the tide lapped hungrily at the stones. His gaze missed nothing: a gondola that lingered too long at a mooring, a man who watched us from beneath his hood, a shutter that closed abruptly as we passed. At one point we paused by a narrow quay where goods were being unloaded from a barge. Holmes studied the crates intently. "Wine, Watson," he said softly. "So the markings claim, yet the weight is too light. Smuggling, without doubt." And observe, the gondoliers bow their heads as they pass, as if in fear. "These waters belong to the Brotherhood." The merchants eyed us suspiciously, and Holmes drew me away before attention could grow. "Every string of this web, Watson, leads back to the same spider. Tonight we must watch again, but this time not from their palace. We shall take the chase to the canals themselves, where the ghost is loosed." That evening, armed with our small lantern and revolver, we returned to the water. Bellini secured a gondola for us, and we took our positions in silence. The city lay wrapped in mist once more, the lanterns of passing boats glowing like distant stars. Holmes guided us to the stretch of canal where the ghost most often appeared. We drifted there, hearts attuned to the faintest sound. The hours passed slowly. Then, with the suddenness of a conjurer's trick, it was there, the same pale figure gliding silently above the water. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Steady, Watson. Let it pass. Tonight we follow, not chase." The ghost moved ahead, its glow reflected in trembling ripples. Holmes rowed with quiet strokes, keeping our distance, guiding us beneath the overhanging arches where shadow concealed us. The apparition turned sharply, down a narrow canal seldom used by gondoliers. Holmes followed without hesitation. At last we saw what he had suspected. The ghost drifted toward a warehouse at the canal's end, its wires guiding it through a narrow gap between the buildings. Holmes brought us close, extinguishing our lantern. In the darkness we watched as the figure vanished into the warehouse itself. "There, Watson," he breathed. "Their true nest." We dared not approach further that night, but Holmes's satisfaction was palpable. When we returned to our lodgings, he could not rest. He paced the room with the energy of a hound at scent. "Do you see, Watson? The ghost is no end in itself, but a lure, a guardian, a weapon to frighten men from this canal. And why? Because the warehouse conceals their treasure, the fruits of their smuggling, their ill-gotten wealth. That is what they guard. That is the heart of their scheme." Bellini, who had followed us, looked grave. "If we can expose that place, we expose them all." "Precisely," Holmes said. "But it must be done with precision. To raid it openly would scatter them like birds. No, we must catch them in the act with their phantom on the waters and their treasures within. Only then will Venice see the Brotherhood unmasked." The plan took shape swiftly. Bellini would arrange for trusted guards of the council to be ready, hidden near the warehouse. Holmes and I would shadow the ghost again, ensuring it led us to its nest. When the Brotherhood gathered, the trap would be sprung. That night I slept little, my mind racing with anticipation and dread. Holmes lay wakeful as well, his eyes fixed upon the ceiling, his thoughts weaving far ahead. I heard him murmur once, "The ghost will haunt its master yet," before silence claimed him. And so the stage was set. Venice herself, the theater, her canals, the aisles, her mists the curtain. The ghost in the canal had led us to its lair, but whether we could unmask the Brotherhood without falling victim to its claws remained a question that chilled even my soldier's blood. The night chosen for Holmes's plan was one of dense fog, the kind of Venetian shroud that reduced distance to inches and made every sound seem both near at hand and impossibly far. Even the bells of the campanile were muffled, their resonance dampened by the heavy air. Gondolas moved like shadows across the waters, their lanterns glowing faintly before vanishing into the whiteness, and more than once I felt the eerie sensation that we drifted in a world detached from Earth itself, afloat in a silence broken only by the rhythmic dip of oars. Holmes was in a state of nervous concentration unlike any I had seen, quiet yet charged with energy. He crouched low in the prow of our gondola, his eyes straining through the mist, his fingers lightly drumming against the gunwale in thought. I had long since learned that at such moments words were not welcome, so I kept silence, though my heart pounded with mingled fear and anticipation. Bellini had arranged his guards in strategic positions, hidden near the warehouse we had spied the night before, but it would fall to Holmes and me to ensure the phantom led us true. We drifted in patient stillness for what felt like hours, the fog enveloping us until even Bellini's presence in the stern seemed distant, a vague shape more than a man. Then, without warning, the apparition appeared. It rose from the water not 20 yards ahead, glowing with the same ghastly pallor, its movements uncannily smooth as it glided into the mist. A low murmur of awe escaped Bellini, but Holmes only inclined his head, his lips curling in a grim smile. "Steady, Watson," he whispered. "Let it guide us." We followed, Holmes rowing with deliberate caution to keep us at a distance. The ghost floated ahead, its light diffused by the fog into a halo that pulsed with each ripple of the water. It turned as before into the narrow canal, the very path Holmes had predicted. My nerves tightened as we drew nearer to the warehouse, its hulking outline barely discernible through the haze. Then came voices, low at first, then rising. From the quay near the warehouse, masked figures emerged, gesturing to the ghost as if saluting it. Others carried crates down to the water, loading them into waiting gondolas. The whole scene unfolded like some infernal rite, the spectral figure hovering above, the men moving in silence below, their faces hidden, their purpose dark. Holmes touched my arm. "This is the moment. Bellini must be ready." He raised a hand in signal. From the shadows of the opposite quay, dark shapes stirred. Council guards, armed and disciplined, advanced silently, spreading to cut off the Brotherhood's retreat. For an instant, the conspirators remained unaware, their attention fixed on their ghost and their cargo. Then as the first guard stepped forward, a cry split the air. Pandemonium erupted. The masked men shouted warnings, some seizing weapons from their gondolas, others scattering in panic. The ghost, untended, swayed wildly on its wires, its light flickering as though the specter itself had been startled. One man hurled a lantern into the canal, the flame sputtering out in steam. Another slashed at the ropes that tethered crates to the quay. "Forward, Watson," Holmes cried. He leapt from our gondola onto the quay with the agility of a man half his age, and I, cursing my aching limbs, followed. Bellini's guards surged past us, grappling with the conspirators. The air filled with the clash of steel, the splash of bodies falling into water, the shouts of men desperate to flee. Holmes pressed through the melee with unerring instinct, his gaze fixed upon the warehouse door. "The heart of the nest lies within," he called, and I stayed close on his heels. We burst into the warehouse, lantern light illuminating a scene of controlled chaos. Piles of crates stood stacked against the walls, their markings hastily obscured. Tables bore maps and ledgers, some now scattered in disarray by the sudden attack. At the center of it all, directing the panicked men with a voice that carried authority, stood a tall figure masked in gold. Holmes froze, his eyes narrowing. "There," he said softly. "The spider at the center of the web." The masked leader turned at our intrusion. For an instant our eyes met through the gleam of his disguise, and I felt the weight of his composure. Unlike the others, he did not panic. Instead, he raised a hand signaling to two of his men. They rushed at us with knives drawn. Holmes darted to one side, seizing a length of timber from the floor. He parried the first blow with surprising strength, striking his attacker across the shoulder and sending him sprawling. The second lunged at me. Instinct, an old soldier's reflex, guided my hand. I drew my revolver, and the man halted, his courage failing before the barrel aimed at his chest. He dropped his weapon and backed away, Meanwhile, the leader had slipped toward a side door. "Holmes!" I shouted, but he was already in pursuit. We tore after the man through a warren of passages that smelled of damp and rot, our footsteps echoing against the stone. The golden mask gleamed ahead, a beacon in the shadows, until at last we burst out onto a narrow quay at the canal's edge. A gondola waited there, its oarsmen ready. The masked figure leapt aboard and shouted an order in rapid Italian. The boat pushed off, vanishing into the fog. Holmes swore under his breath, his hands clenched in frustration. "They have their leader still," he muttered. "The Brotherhood is wounded but not slain. Without him in custody, the route remains." Bellini and his guard soon joined us, dragging with them a handful of captured conspirators and a trove of confiscated documents. The ghost contraption, tangled and half-submerged, was hauled from the canal, its false magic extinguished at last. Yet for all the night's success, Holmes's mood was grim. Back in our lodgings, as dawn's pale light crept across the floor, he paced in restless thought. "We have unmasked their methods," he said. "We have scattered their men, and Bellini has enough evidence to prove their crimes. Yet the leader, the man in the golden mask, slipped through our fingers. He will gather what remains, strike again, and Venice will continue to suffer until he is found." I tried to console him, reminding him that much had been achieved, that the council now had proof beyond denial. But he shook his head. "Proof, Watson, is the foundation. The keystone remains missing. Until I place my hand upon the throat of the Brotherhood's master, this case is unfinished." Exhaustion finally claimed him, and he sank into uneasy sleep. As I watched the morning grow brighter outside our window, I felt a chill settle over me. For though the ghost in the canal had been revealed as trickery, the true specter, the man whose will had conjured fear across Venice, still moved somewhere in the city's shadows, plotting his next move. And Holmes, I knew, would not rest until that shadow was banished into the light. The dawn after the raid upon the warehouse broke with a strange quiet, as though the city itself hesitated to acknowledge what had transpired under cover of darkness. The fog had lifted, revealing a clear blue sky that cast Venice in deceptive serenity. From our lodgings overlooking a narrow canal, I could hear the ordinary rhythms of the day resuming: gondoliers calling for fares, vendors hawking their wares, the chatter of voices along the quays. Yet within, the air was heavy with unfinished business. Holmes had not risen, though I knew he was not asleep. He sat motionless in his chair, his long fingers steepled before his face, his eyes fixed on some point beyond sight. The remnants of the night's struggle lay about the room. Bellini's guards had delivered to us bundles of confiscated documents, ledgers filled with coded transactions, maps marked with the Brotherhood's routes. On the table near Holmes rested the shattered remains of the ghost's contraption, its lanterns extinguished, its wires twisted into useless coils. I examined one of the ledgers idly, marveling at the precision of the entries. Every crate, every bribe, every shipment was accounted for, though disguised beneath a cipher I could not hope to unravel. Holmes, however, had already begun the task, his keen mind slicing through the code with ruthless efficiency. "It is as I suspected," he said at last, breaking his silence. "These records are not merely accounts of smuggling and extortion. They are the balance sheets of a government behind the government, a shadow republic within the republic. Every merchant who paid tribute, every gondolier who bent his knee, every official who looked the other way. Here they are, neatly catalogued. The Brotherhood of the Lion is no mere fraternity of rogues, Watson. It is an institution, as old and entrenched as the city itself. And yet wounded," I reminded him. "We struck hard last night. Many of their men are in custody. Surely their power is broken." Holmes lowered his hands slowly, his expression grim. "A serpent with many coils may lose a few and still strike. Their leader escaped. The man in the golden mask. He is the mind, the architect, the one who wove fear into the very fabric of these canals. Until he is unmasked, Venice remains under his shadow." We were interrupted by a knock at the door. Bellini entered, his face drawn with fatigue but alight with determination. He carried with him a satchel of documents. "The council has acted," he said. "Those we captured are imprisoned. The evidence is overwhelming, maps, ledgers, even the ghost itself. The people will know the truth at last." Holmes rose and bowed slightly, though his manner remained cool. "That is well, Signor Bellini. Yet your city is not safe. The lion still prowls. Until its master is caged, all else is but reprieve. Bellini set the satchel upon the table. Then you will hunt him still? I will not leave Venice while his shadow lies across it, Holmes replied simply. Tell me, among the families of this city, who is most likely to bear such a mantle? Who moves unseen, commands allegiance, and yet hides behind mask and silence? Bellini hesitated. There are several houses of ancient name, men of wealth and cunning. To accuse them without proof, I accuse no one, Holmes cut in. But I observe, I compare, I deduce, and I will find the golden mask. The hours that followed were consumed by this hunt, though it was a chase unlike any other I had witnessed. Holmes did not scour the alleys nor question the gondoliers. Instead, he pored over the ledgers, piecing together patterns invisible to my eye. He traced the routes of tribute through the canals, matched dates of shipments with records of political votes, and cross-referenced names hinted at in the cipher with the movements of merchants and nobles alike. His mind seemed to expand across the city, weaving every strand of information into a single tightening web. By afternoon, he looked up with sudden clarity. Watson, Bellini, I have him. The ghost has worn many masks, but only one man profits most from its terror. Only one stands at the crossroads of every ledger, every payment, every silence purchased. He is a noble of long standing, a patron of the arts, a philanthropist by day, and the Brotherhood's master by night. Who? I demanded. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Count Vittorio Morenzoni, Bellini gasped. Morenzoni? Impossible. He is revered in Venice. His family has served the Republic for centuries. He funds hospitals, churches, the carnival itself. To expose him would be to save your city, Holmes finished coldly. Do not mistake gilded charity for innocence. He gives with one hand to conceal what the other steals. And last night I saw his stature, his bearing, his height. The man in the golden mask was no common thug. He was Count Morenzoni. The revelation hung heavy in the air. Bellini paced, torn between disbelief and conviction. If you are right, Holmes, then Venice has lived under his dominion for longer than we guessed. But proof beyond doubt must be found. Holmes smiled faintly, and we shall find it tonight. The plan was simple in outline, perilous in execution. Morenzoni would host a masquerade that evening in his palazzo, a grand affair drawing nobles and dignitaries from across Venice. Holmes resolved that we must attend disguised among the guests and watch for the moment when the Count betrayed his double life. The golden mask, Holmes argued, would not be far from him. A man so proud of his creation would never discard it entirely. That evening we dressed as the Venetians did, cloaked in anonymity beneath ornate masks. I confess to feeling a thrill of unreality as we joined the procession across the Grand Canal, the city glittering with lights, music drifting from the palaces, gondolas adorned like floating jewels. It seemed a dream, yet beneath its beauty lurked deadly purpose. The Palazzo Morenzoni was ablaze with lanterns, its marble steps crowded with masked figures in silks and feathers. Within, music swelled, dancers twirled, laughter rang. We moved among them unnoticed, mere shadows in the revelry. Yet Holmes's gaze never rested. He scanned the throng with hawk-like intensity, searching for the man who ruled Venice from behind a phantom. At last we saw him. Count Vittorio Morenzoni, tall and commanding even beneath his disguise, greeted his guests with the grace of a practiced host. His mask was of silver, not gold, but upon his breast gleamed a small emblem, a lion wrought in gold. Holmes's hand tightened upon my arm. There, Watson, he wears his pride openly. But watch, he will betray himself. For hours we lingered, observing. Morenzoni moved among his guests with ease, but at intervals he withdrew to speak with certain men in hushed tones, gestures precise, eyes sharp. Holmes shadowed him with relentless patience. At one point, when the Count stepped into a secluded gallery, Holmes signaled me to follow. We crept close, concealed behind a curtain. There we saw Morenzoni produce from beneath his cloak the very mask of gold we had glimpsed in the warehouse. He held it in his hands a moment, gazing upon it as if in reverence, before passing it to a subordinate who vanished swiftly into the crowd. Holmes's eyes blazed. The game is ended, Watson. The lion bares its teeth. Yet before we could act, Morenzoni turned, his gaze sweeping the gallery. For an instant I feared we had been discovered. His eyes seemed to pierce the shadows, and I felt a chill as though he looked directly upon us. Then he smiled faintly, as if amused by some private jest, and returned to his guests. Holmes exhaled softly. He suspects. We must move carefully, but we have seen enough. Tonight, Bellini's counsel must act. The golden mask is proof, and we have witnessed it with our own eyes. We left the palazzo in silence, slipping away before suspicion could take root. The city outside seemed darker now, the revelry within a hollow echo of the danger that lurked. Holmes walked swiftly, his mind already leaping ahead. Tomorrow, Watson, Venice will awaken to a new dawn. The Brotherhood will fall, its lion unmasked. And then our ghost will be laid to rest. I said nothing, for I knew well the peril that still awaited. Morenzoni was no fool. He had ruled from shadows for decades, and such a man would not yield without a fight. The night felt heavy with foreboding, as though the canals themselves whispered warning. Yet beside me, Holmes strode with the calm certainty of a man who had already seen the ending, his path lit by the unerring flame of reason. And so the final act approached, each step drawing us closer to the moment when mask and man, ghost and master, would be torn apart beneath the relentless gaze of Sherlock Holmes. The night of the masquerade proved only the prelude. Holmes had seen the golden mask, had traced it to Count Vittorio Morenzoni's own hand. Yet the man moved with such composure among his guests that no accusation could stand without absolute proof. Bellini, though shaken, agreed to one final gambit. The council would assemble in secrecy, and Holmes would present the evidence gathered. But first, the mask itself must be seized. Thus, when the revels ended and the last gondola bore its cargo of laughter away, Holmes and I did not retire. Cloaked still in our disguises, we shadowed the Count's retinue as they slipped from the palazzo. The fog had returned, thick and spectral, wrapping the canals in silence. It seemed almost fitting that the Brotherhood's fate should be sealed in such ghostly shrouds. We followed them to a smaller palace on a forgotten waterway, where the Count, believing himself unseen, dismissed his servants and entered alone. Holmes gave a nod, and together we crossed the water, forcing open a side door with practiced ease. Within, the silence was profound, broken only by the echo of our footsteps across marble floors. We found him in a chamber lit by a single lamp. Upon the table lay the golden mask, gleaming like a trophy in the dimness. Morenzoni stood before it, unmasked at last, his face as proud and composed as when he welcomed his guests. He did not startle at our intrusion. Rather, he smiled as though expecting us. "So," he said softly, his voice smooth as silk, "the English detective. I wondered how long it would take you." Holmes advanced, every line of his body taut with resolve. "Your Brotherhood is broken, Count. Your ghost lies in ruin, your men in chains. The council has proof enough to end you." Morenzoni lifted the mask and regarded it with a kind of melancholy reverence. "Proof, perhaps. Yet Venice loves its illusions. I gave them a ghost to fear, and they obeyed. I gave them charity to admire, and they applauded. Which face do you think they will believe, the golden lion or the humble benefactor?" "Both," Holmes answered sharply. "And when they see both belong to the same man, they will tear you down with their own hands. Fear has betrayed you, Count. The very ghost you conjured has led us here." For the first time, Morenzoni's composure wavered. He set the mask down, his gaze hardening. "You speak boldly for a stranger in my city." "I speak plainly for truth," Holmes said. At that moment, the door burst open. Bellini entered with half a dozen guards of the council, their weapons drawn. Morenzoni did not resist. He stood tall, regal even in defeat, as they bound his hands. His eyes met Holmes's once more, burning with a strange mixture of hatred and admiration. "You have killed a lion," he said quietly. "But beware, detective, lions are remembered long after they fall." He was led away, and the golden mask, symbol of fear and power, was carried as evidence. When the dawn came, the city awoke to news that shook it to its core. Count Vittorio Morenzoni, beloved noble and benefactor, had been unmasked as the master of the Brotherhood of the Lion. His trial was swift, his guilt undeniable. Venice, freed from the shadow of extortion and fear, rejoiced. The canals were no longer haunted save by memory. On our final evening, Holmes and I took a gondola along the Grand Canal. The waters shimmered in the moonlight, serene once more. I could not help but remark upon the strangeness of it all, that a ghost, which had seemed at first no more than a sailor's fancy, had revealed a conspiracy as old as the city itself. Holmes, reclining with eyes half closed, gave a faint smile. Ghosts, my dear Watson, are but the inventions of men, sometimes born of superstition, more often of greed. They vanish when exposed to reason. Venice will have its phantoms still, for such is its nature, but this one at least has been laid to rest. The gondola drifted onward, carrying us beneath bridges older than memory, past palaces reflected in the silvered water. The city whispered its eternal song, and I thought, as I so often did, that wherever the shadows of the world deepened, Sherlock Holmes would be there to pierce them with the clear, relentless light of truth. And so ended our adventure in Venice. The ghost in the canal was gone, the brotherhood broken, and the lion's mask forever tarnished. Yet in the silence between oar strokes I could not help but wonder how many more phantoms waited in the corners of the world, and how long before Holmes would be called to banish them.